decline of the frost belt and rise of the sun belt, or the shift towards Japan, so forth. Now, how has the United States responded to this situation? Well, I don't think very well. And I think we're looking at the decline and fall of the American age, of a great power. Now, that decline and fall, if it's anything like Britain's, will not be, come great crashing down like Rome with the barbarians at the gates or something of that order. Although, of course, it's arguable in this world who's the barbarian sometimes. But my argument is that the United States has declined because of its inability to respond creatively enough and rapidly enough to the challenges of this era. And that the primary failure is not government, not budget deficits, not labor, the failure of business to innovate and to adapt and to figure out these new systems and advance these new systems. And a secondary failure is that in the face of our own inability to change, we have seized upon short-term political panaceas, nostrums, like deregulation, that have done nothing, and if anything have made matters worse. And what we have is essentially the 80s were a lost opportunity to respond to a changing world that has cost the United States a generation at least. Okay, what kind of responses does the United States have dominated in the U.S.? I'm going to be intentionally, kind of churlish about this. First one is denial. Nothing wrong. That was certainly the car makers' response to the imports of Japanese cars in the 1970s. The oil company response to the growth of OPEC's power. The steel company's response to their own obsolescence. They just kept building bigger and bigger furnaces based on 1910 technology. And the result was, of course, you have a lot of very big furnaces that are now having to be dismantled. The second response is blame. It's not my fault. It's not management's fault. It's you workers. Or it's the government. Or it's environmental regulations. The steel industry cried and wept all through the 1970s over the Clean Air Act. God, you guys are closing us down because of these pollution regulations. Well, in fact, they got all the pollution regulations set aside just in time to be closed down by the Koreans, the Germans, the Brazilians, and the Japanese. But as long as it happens by the market, it's okay. If it's environmental laws, and a kind of socially conscious attempt to do something more sensible and not poison yourselves, that's bad. Or as one worker, I plucked this quote out of the newspaper, a worker at Xerox put it recently, until 4 years ago, they didn't care how you put the machines together as long as you did it in time. 4 years ago. That's slow response time. But at least Xerox responded, and they're doing very well right now. So there's one bright spot. Or they responded, they knew there was a problem, but they got it all wrong. We call this clueless in Detroit. General Motors thought that the Japanese did it with robots. We had this kind of thing about robotics, this sort of robotics boom in the early 80s, late 70s. And GM was really shocked when they set up the first joint GM-Toyota plant out in California, the NUMMI plant, New United Motors Manufacturing Incorporated, NUMMI. They discovered that the Japanese did it with less automation than they had in some of their plants and got higher productivity. That blew their minds. And I don't think they've gotten them back yet. Not at GM. Another strategy is to abandon ship. Export your capital. U.S. companies have been exporting capital since the 50s. In the 50s, they did it because they had the best technology and the best products in many cases. But since then, they've been exporting because they don't have the best products and the best technology, and it's a way of cutting costs. And there's also cost-cutting frenzies at home. Cut out reams of management, some of it, of course, good. Lay off workers. Try and just squeeze down on all unnecessary costs. It's effective up to a point, but it's not a very dynamic strategy. Simple cost-cutting is not enough. You've got to put the pieces together in a new way. The worst, of course, is when you say, abandon ship by saying, enough for manufacturing. I'm not going to invest in manufacturing because it looks lousy profit rates. I don't know how to make it any better, so I think I'll take my portfolio and invest in real estate or oil futures. And that's what we've done. in the last 10 years, about 15% of the borrowing, borrowing for investment, so the indebtedness of industrial corporations, 15% of that has gone to real plant and equipment, 85% of it's gone to mergers, buyouts, and other assorted speculative activities. You get the same response with regard to government, which is just cut costs. Just slash your education system. That's what we do in California. We've fallen from, I think, 5th in the country to 38th in per capita school spending. A really brilliant response to the new high-tech world, of which we should be the most familiar. Plundering the assets. That's a good strategy. If you don't know how to make anything, take the old things and milk them for all they're worth. So you get companies buying companies and milking the profits out of them and closing down. You get things like we had in California, the Maxim Corporation, a financial ghost that bought up Pacific Lumber, the last company in the West Coast that actually did manage timber cutting and had done it for 50 years profitably. You don't have to clear cut. You can actually make a profit without clear cutting. So they were bought by a financial firm on a junk bond buyout and immediately started clear cutting to pay off the junk bonds. So, cut your redwoods, pay off your debts. That's one way to do it. The Southern Pacific Railroad, another brilliant West Coast example. They didn't know how to railroad anymore. They can't build a track. They can't run a train without it hopping off the track and dumping chemicals into the Sacramento River. So what you did is you just sold off the railroad to Santa Fe. You then took all the land, which the railroad owns, and started building office buildings and things on it to try and make a profit on real estate. Well, that's fine. I mean, we need some buildings, but it isn't a way to run a transportation system. Another strategy, of course, is to go for cheap labor. Oh, by the way, you can plunder assets abroad. I mean, you can go, like I said, you can go to timber in Siberia if you want. Cheap labor, well, I mentioned that earlier. You can do the Mexico strategy, the North American Free Trade strategy, export your manufacturing capital that way. That certainly keeps the companies profitable up to a point, but it doesn't mean they actually respond well to Japanese competition. It doesn't mean that the GM plants going into Mexico are up to snuff technologically. They're not. And how long will that strategy last? In some ways, it's sort of the last gasp of the Fordist era. Another strategy, or lack of strategy, is what I call poor imitations or going through the motions. One of the reasons we often don't take Japanese production methods or German production methods seriously is because when we try to use them, the management does it in a kind of quick and dirty way, like phony participation circles, quality circles where the managers lecture the workers, halfway just in time, kind of like, well, more in time, but not actually a pull-through just in time, tight quality control system. Better quality, but still not good enough quality. Flexible machinery used inflexibly. There's some very interesting studies about how American machining companies buy these fancy flexible machines and then use them in the same old stiff-armed way they always have. So that isn't going to work. Another strategy or failure is a fear of the workers and a distrust by management of workers' intelligence. The precise reason they won't adopt some of these new systems, or even these aren't all that new, is because it often means you have to continually upgrade the skills of your workers. You have to listen to some of their suggestions. I'm not saying it's a worker's paradise, mind you, but it's in many ways much better than the old American system, which is that the worker is a cog and the worker is a fool. The example I have to use is the Saturn plant. GM did it right at Saturn. GM poured zillions into the Saturn plant. They produce a hell of a good car. It's very productive. It has a very high level of worker involvement and worker direction on the shop floor. My friend Harley Shaken was there recently, and the director of planning for GM called him into his office. He happened to be at the Saturn plant. And they were talking, and Harley said, well, this is really impressive. And the guy said, yeah, but we'll never do it again. I said, what? This is the best thing GM's done. The one thing you can point to of GM showing some real intelligence. You know why they won't do it again? It's because the workers have too much power. Or there's the Caterpillar strategy. Caterpillar adapted very well to Japanese competitions, been outboxing Komatsu for a few years now, and they rely on their workers for some kind of participation, and they need the skills of the workers. And so what do? They have a lockout and try and drive down wages. Not because they aren't competitive, because they could get higher profits if they squeeze their workers. Well, it sounds to me like shooting yourself in the foot. Financial deregulation is another strategy. You can just deregulate finance capital so it can rush around and indulge in anything other than manufacturing. And the U.S. is notorious for its short profit horizon. It has now become very clear that U.S. capital wants profits right now. If you can't produce in a quarter, if you can't produce in a year, forget it. One of the reasons I'm told that the U.S. companies aren't in Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe, where there are some very good profit opportunities, is because Eastern Europe's such a mess that it takes a while. You've got to have a long time horizon to rebuild. So who's there? The Germans. It's also because the Germans have some surplus money, which we don't have right now. And, of course, another model that's been very effective in the 80s is melt the government. This is, it's so ironic, the Reagan-Bush people for years have been telling us about welfare chiselers. And, what is the biggest form of milking the government is, of course, the defense industry. This I call the West LA model. And we've done very well in California off this, although I think the party may be over. So defense spending's great. It's non-competitive, cost plus. You indulge in the most exotic technologies that are of absolutely no use to anyone else in the world. Things like, nuclear-hardened electronics, so that your satellites can still direct the missiles after the nuclear holocaust. A truly important technology of immediate consumer application. Because we all want to be able to go down to the mall the day after Doomsday. Now, I will finish in about 5 minutes, if you'll bear with me. Sorry for being long-winded. By saying something about the politics behind all this. Going back to my long wave, this long epic, it seems to me that there's a larger sense of politics we need to have than this election, or even the 1980s, catastrophic as they were. And that reaches back to at least World War II. What happened after World War II was that the United States was the supreme power. Everything was right. We were the best producers. We were the model, political model for the world and all that. So we were eager to consolidate our position, and the ruling elites of the United States did just that. They initiated the Cold War. They isolated the communist world. They tried to isolate it anyway. They started this battle against communism that provided that kind of rock, one rock against which you could anchor yourself. They then, well, I'll come back to that. The second front was internal, a second front of a kind of fundamental conservatism of our era, of our 50 years. Not liberalism, but conservatism. That was internal because of the advances of labor, of the Communist Party, of the New Deal in the 1930s, which the conservatives, the business class, absolutely hated. And after the war, they quickly moved to get things like Taft-Hartley to initiate the Red Scare and the McCarthy period, which was very convenient. Nobody really objected to McCarthy until he attacked the army, which really was trying to lock this Cold War mentality, rigidify this social order internally. So externally and internally, the U.S. locked itself into a mode of triumph. Meanwhile, these other places I've mentioned, like Japan and Germany, having been disasters politically themselves and produced fascism and militarism and the most disgusting kind of military expansionism, had, of course, been defeated, annihilated, and were totally restructured. Now, I won't say it was quite the Russian Revolution, but it was a very significant internal restructuring of the capitalist order on both sides. And as a result, in Japan, if you look at something like the origins of the just-in-time system, you see that this man, Ono, who invented it, was a kind of, I think, an archetypal character within a company, by the way, Toyota, which was archetypal in that it was outside the old Zaibatsu had been broken up. or it's partly broken up. And here you had a kind of new capitalist company with a young, bright manager who could move up through the ranks with this new idea, this just-in-time idea, and develop it. That's what you need, is that kind of political class openness for new ideas to filter up. The other thing, of course, the Japanese were devastated by the war, and there was a national commitment to rebuild and to use whatever resources they had to learn how the Americans did it and how to do it better. That's not the commitment we had. Our commitment was, let's suppress any kind of hostile change in the world and keep doing what we've been doing. So that kind of political mentality echoed the economic mentality. In the 1960s, of course, there was a moment of opening, a moment of attack on that sort of rigid world. But what happened after the 60s? I mean, there was some long-term beneficial effect. I notice we can now wear beards and things. And that continues right through things like the gay and lesbian liberation movement today. But there was a very powerful reaction to that, a hatred for those gains that carries on to this day in the politics of the Republican Party and the New Right. A guy like Bush, whatever else you think of him, is born and bred in that Cold War epoch. That's what he thinks. He basically thinks the world's okay, and he says it. We're the best. Everything's fine. Now, that's not a very good attitude if things really aren't fine. If things really are fine, okay. But if they're not fine, as I've argued, in a variety of ways, even for American capitalism, let alone for American labor and American gays and things like that, then you've got a problem with that kind of mentality. Well, the 1980s were, as I said, actually a backward step throughout the United States and Europe. We had Thatcherism in Britain, which just opened up British industry to world competition to make sure it would be sacked, kind of like the fall of Rome. Thatcher produced an effect equivalent to the Great Depression after she got into office. That is a decline of manufacturing of about 1/3. And now under Major, this last couple of years, British industry has fallen, I think, by 6 to 10% again. So Britain's in very serious trouble, and Thatcherism did a really great job of reviving it. In Europe, a generalized attack by the liberals, the neoliberals, as they're called in Europe, the Thatcherites, on social democracy. After the French socialists capitulated in about 1982 to the forces of international capital and became modernizers, after Felipe Gonzalez decided to follow the technocratic road in Spain, social democracy was pretty much spent as a force in Europe and has been on the defensive ever since. We also, of course, get the structural adjustments by the IMF all around the third world to make sure that countries like Mexico learn their lesson as far as being too kind to the poor, too liberal with their government spending. In the United States, of course, we got a whole raft of policies under the Reaganites, which were basically those cost-cutting policies. Attack unions, cut labor costs, make it easier for capital to free itself from old plant and equipment and speculate in anything it wants. Cutting taxes to the wealthy so that they could live even better. Setting consumption loose without regard to production so that your imports rise and your balance of trade gets worse and your debt gets worse. The amount of debt that piled up in the 1980s is truly astronomical. It's 4 or 5 times anything that happened in the whole post-war period before. They cut the dollar loose. They cut the bankers loose. They cut the right-wing moralizers loose. It was quite a time. But what the effect of that was not just its disagreeable social effects, but that it cut the economy loose from any moorings. This economy has been adrift in a sea of money sloshing around, of junk bonds, S&L, CDs. The Charles Keatings are the men of our age, and Michael Millikens, another couple of Californians, I'm unhappy to say. So what we've done is had this ideology of the market. It's not just that I dislike the ideology of the market. It's not that I think that the market isn't a marvelous institution in many ways. It's just that I don't worship it. And I see that the effects of this this cutting loose from all government direction, from all political direction, have been bad. That the U.S. has not responded very creatively under the spur of the market. And the evidence from countries like Japan, Korea, Germany, is that all the successful countries of our age use much more association, management, steering, planning, government direction, whatever you want to call it, at a number of different levels than we do. And they use very creatively these new organizational forms. I mean, I'm not saying that the old simple model of central planning that was put forward under Russian communism is the answer. The complexity of the division of labor in our time is such that that kind of planning does not work and can't conceivably work for the next, I don't know how long. But what we're seeing within capitalism itself is the development of new modes of organization at various levels that indicate that this is a highly organized economy, and where it is well organized and well directed, it does better. And that's the kind of direction that we need to move in. Now, I think there are signs of the ice breaking up. A couple of minutes. The Maastricht fiasco. The people of Europe, the voters of Europe, are very unhappy with the Eurocrats and with a financial capital in charge. The conservative governments are all rather unpopular in Europe right now. And the Republicans are very likely on their way out as of today. So where do we go? Well, we've got an interesting moment here. And if Clinton comes in, he has talked about strategies like public investment, which is a good idea since we're 51st in national spending on infrastructure per capita. We need an industrial policy. We need to govern investment, to direct strategically investment, new technologies, research. We need a labor policy and an education policy that does develop skills. We need redistribution for the welfare and the stabilization of the people, the mass of the people, as well as for a mass market, which has been diminishing in the United States. And, Clinton, to his credit, has said some things about that. But the numbers, he said, his $20 billion in public investment, would be about 1/5 of what they spend on public investment in the United Kingdom, 1/15 of what they spend in free market Japan. So it's quite extraordinarily small. Clinton, to me, sounds like FDR in 1932, coming in after the wreckage of Hoover and saying we've got to balance the budget, which he tried to do right through 1936. Fortunately, there were some social movements, and the situation was so disastrous that FDR was forced to do things more dramatic than that. Although in the end, of course, it still took World War II to get us out of the Great Depression. So Clinton's strategies are in the right direction, but they're not enough. And in some ways, they're in the wrong directions. His policy on labor is appallingly bad. What's the lesson to go away with? That we need, obviously, a new direction at the top. But beyond that, we need a new commitment as a people to the intelligent and humane management of our economy. And without that kind of mastery of this powerful system that's essentially out of our control right now, and scrambling our lives as well as the map of the world, without some kind of control of that understanding and command and direction of control of that system, our lives will be fundamentally out of control. So I leave you on that thought. So I'll be happy to take questions if you can bear with me any longer. But we'll let those who can't go first. Okay, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you were talking about, you mentioned geographic specificity quite a few times. And you mentioned also, when you're talking about Benetton and the Gap, these to me are very kind of global entities and global businesses. And you also start talking about new technologies. And it seems to me, as just this ordinary consumer, that with all these new technologies, every time the technologies, there's a removal on the part of the consumer from where these products are from. There's a removal of the consumer from the idea that this grape you're getting is from Chile, the flour you're getting is from Africa, and that with each stage of removal of the part of the consumer, that this sort of new notion of this humane idea of technology, this humane idea of production, is harder and harder for the consumer because they are so removed from the processes that are involved. I mean, you don't even have to go to the store anymore to buy your clothing. You mail order it, and you have no idea where that's coming from.
I can say I'm getting increasingly removed from my audience too, but anyway. First part of the question. Some of these systems are remarkably localized, though. As I said with Benetton, it really all goes back to the Veneto region. And they don't have a globalized system except at the retail end. The marketing end, that's right. There are also these systems that become global, not only in one company, but spread to other companies as a good example of how to do things. Often have very specific origins in certain kinds of areas with a certain technological tradition, a certain social tradition. Something like the flexible production of Third Italy is strongly based on these small towns with a strong agricultural hinterland, with a strong kind of small business, small enterprise tradition, goes back centuries in many cases, but certainly back to the beginning of this century, and very powerful political organization by the small owners, often under the Communist Party, ironically enough, of Italy. And then it kind of spreads from there. But often it doesn't spread that easily because the social relations have to go with it. And so people try to say, hey, we'll be the next Silicon Valley out in Iowa. But Silicon Valley has very weird social relations. Very strange. This whole, there is this whole culture of the computer nerd, sort of, to put it grossly, with its kind of free-thinking, no-tie kind of culture. And it's very different than Route 128, which is one of the reasons why they beat out Route 128. Now, the second part of your question is about the distance between the producer and the consumer. Yes. I don't know there's any going back. There are ways that you can certainly try to develop local production. I'm thinking of something like organic produce, which relocalizes a lot of production. Though that may get more globalized as time goes on too. I think we're talking about a process in human development there that is probably irreversible. It may be triggered by capitalism, but I can't associate it uniquely with capitalism. Say, in the great future, we will get rid of the division of labor, we'll get rid of the global division of labor, and everybody will know exactly where their food's grown and their clothes is made. I don't believe that's going to happen. I think there have got to be other strategies of education and control to make that possible. Just like we don't live just in city-states anymore. We live in very large nations. And there have to be methods of making those democratic, which we're sometimes rather poor at, I might add. So it's a very serious human problem, but I'm not sure it's one you can undo. Sir?
From a geographic perspective, how much of a factor is transportation costs as adding friction or...
Well, there's no question that the lowering of transport costs and improvements in communications have vastly increased the ability to go abroad, to globalize these systems. Just no question about it. But there's a whole number of other conditions that go along with that. Improved organizational structures, from the corporation to marketing networks, that make possible something like a global oil market. You've got to have a tremendous number of oil wholesalers, commodity dealers in London to make that happen. And that's not just a communication problem, that's an organizational problem. Also, if you're going to go into Mexico or into Southeast Asia to produce globally, it takes an advance of the level of labor skill, labor discipline, political control, and so on to make that possible, which is a social question, not a technical one.
So you're really suggesting that transportation costs are a minimal part of this, it's organization costs.
Yeah, I would say transport costs. It's important. I can point out certain instances where it's decisive, like where you're going to locate an oil terminal. But in a lot of cases, it's not very decisive anymore. It's a kind of backcloth. So in the work I've done in economic geography has been very strongly to kind of overturn the older view that made it all transport determined. It just doesn't work. It doesn't explain much anymore. Yes, sir.
What are the educational institutions doing to address the kind of problem that you brought up?
To try and deal with the problems? Well, I don't know. I mean, the strategies I see are sometimes exactly the wrong ones. It's kind of, let's plunder our universities for new technologies. Here we have these we've created some quite magnificent institutions of higher learning and the spread of knowledge and research. And what happens in some of these areas, like biotech at University of California, no one will talk to anybody anymore. And half of them aren't there anymore because they've gone into private business. Now, what does that do to the development of knowledge in the university? I think it's pretty adverse effect. So one way of looking at this, a cynical view is saying, well, we don't know how to produce things. We know we've got these really good universities. Let's plunder them for a while and get some great ideas out of them, and maybe that'll give us some high-tech companies here and there. Maybe that's too cynical. Obviously, universities can and have to adapt to sort of, to work, I think, in new areas of technology and organization. I don't have any problem with, universities being connected to biotechnology. I mean, there are moral and political questions in biotechnology, but I don't think that is inherently bad, that universities might be working in that area. The danger is that what's immediately commercializable, certain kinds of manipulations of genes or manipulations of lipids and so on, is actually a very limited view of cell process. And it's sometimes, the tap turns off for research that's a little more speculative and general about cell processes that may have a big payoff later on. It's always that danger of the short-term kind of mentality. Yes, sir?
You've commented about the importance of the new organizational forms in these matters. Could you comment a little further on the importance of some of the new technologies as motivating, implementing, permitting these new organizational forms to occur? I'm thinking of communication.
Well, yeah, there is an argument. There are people who say that it's basically computers and information technologies that are central to these organizational forms. And obviously, who's to minimize the computer revolution? And I go back and forth on this sometimes. But it is clear to me that there are organizational technologies themselves, organizational forms, like the just-in-time system, or like certain forms of work teams, ad hoc work teams for problem solving, that are in no way reducible to computer technologies. So I think we've got two things going on here that are often highly overlapped, but highly complementary. Yeah, and I think you'll find over in management schools and so on, they're talking about techniques of planning and brainstorming and matrix organization and things like that are in no way sort of simply computer technologies. But obviously people are still interested in how do you manage information, how do you manage knowledge for management, for organization, and computers come right into the center of that. But it's like the debate over AI in a way, how do you use a computer for knowledge management? And expert systems based on a very simple model of the mind and knowledge, they're great for certain things like fixing a machine or oil drilling. But, there's a very substantial body of work in cognitive sciences that says, whoa, that is really a trivial view of the use of computer to imitate higher mental faculties. And in the future, we'll think that was pretty crude stuff. Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning that rates of profit are declining in manufacturing and generally, and there's a lot of capital sloshing around.
Right.
And the amount of capital has increased substantially. It isn't clear to me why the amount of capital is greater than the productive outlet. And you said you might expand on that, I think. I'd like to hear that. And related to that, if there is much more capital than there used to be, then they should be chasing opportunities for manufacturing in this country, and be willing to take lower rates of profits than the traditional. Why is that?
Okay, first question about the why can't the capital, why should there be excess capital? That's what you're asking, really. Well, two reasons. One, if we look at without the financial system, it's just a question of, it's not a question of sort of absolutely too much capital. It's always relative to its outlets. There's a buildup of, you make profits, you have new investable surplus to reinvest. And you continue reinvesting that as long as there's something to invest in. But if you can't find an outlet to invest in, if that outlet doesn't produce the profits you hoped it would, if you can't switch your capital out of old fixed investments to new quick enough, then those fixed investments will be sub-profitable. So there's a number of ways in which you can get trapped in sub-profitable investments, or you can invest in stuff that just doesn't pay off. So there's a kind of importance here of the rate of change of development of technology, of new products, of higher productivity, and that rate has to keep up with the rate of the development of surplus, investable surplus. The switching problem between old capital and new capital is a difficult one, and there's a constant problem of writing off old capital fast enough, and if you can't do that, so it's a rigidity question, an adjustment question in a sense. And there's also, of course, other people are building up and investing too, and so you have to see this as a whole set of centers of accumulation that are racing with each other, glutting markets, glutting investment outlets. That, to my mind, is the foundation of it. Now, in addition, there's a financial system which creates fictitious capital. You borrow for the future to invest, and you do that all the time. And that it's much easier, in a way, to see that can outrun your potential for the production of profits. And in the 80s, it's pretty obvious that's what happened. You just a massive amount of debt that you really couldn't amortize. It was taken out, the debt was taken out on the belief that junk bonds really were good investments, say, and they really weren't. So that paper has to be written off. So paper has to be written off, a fixed industrial plant has to be written off, and so on. Now let's see, there was a second part of the question. Oh.
The role of capital, why not more manufacturing?
Yeah, why didn't it go into manufacturing? Yeah, that's trickier, and I think that partly depends. Partly, I think the analysis would say that money that had gone into the financial system discovered non-productive outlets that nonetheless in the short term produced a lot of profit, and so it ended up just sort of circulating those domains and reaping rapid profit, which in the long run would not pay off for the whole system, but in the short run was extremely profitable for people in that domain. So that's been part of the issue. And another part of the issue, I think, is something that goes back to a more Keynesian institutional view of the sort of culture of investment. And if you don't see the opportunities, or you're not willing to take those risks anymore, long-term risks in manufacturing, you just say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to get in that domain. I think that has happened too. Any more questions? Okay, we'll pull the plug. Thank you very much.